My name is Fernando Ortiz Ehmann. As Friedrich introduced me, I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Safran. Safran is a brand consultancy. We've been around for 20 years. We are no more than 70 professionals, but however, with 20 different nationalities, 14 languages, 5 locations, 1 team. So we really feel we are, as we call, natively global. We have clients all over the world, ranging from San Francisco, where we work with Facebook, to Tokyo, working with Kyocera, and every country in between. In 2019, we worked in 20 different countries. So as you can imagine, the plane is my next best place after being in the office and at home. Friedrich asked me today to really speak about this topic, which is actually a very difficult topic, which is this idea of why should you not cut down your budgets and investments on marketing and investment in a crisis. So, and the reason, as he already mentioned, probably he felt that I was a good candidate to give you my point of view and my views on it, is because I've been on both sides of the coin, right? I've been now for over 5 years in agency. I started my career also in the agency, and in between, as they joke in the office, I was on the dark side. I was for 10 years on the client side, working both for the LVMH conglomerate, the luxury conglomerate, as well as with fashion brand, Spanish fashion brand Desigual. So there have been organizations that were very operational, very down to earth, where you have to deal with budgets, with sales quotas, with a lot of corporate politics, a lot of operational issues. This idea of just to get it done, I don't care how, but please just get it done. I need that EBITDA, whatever that sales figure is. And I'm sure many of you in the audience have had that feeling when you go to speak to your boss and he replies, don't bother me with the nitty-gritty details and just get it done. So I actually call this business in the trenches. So I literally, as many of you, and most probably nowadays, you're really in the trenches, really fighting for your business. And I know I've been that. So I guess that sounds very familiar to you. And therefore, for the next 10 to 11 minutes, because probably already 1 minute went away, I just wanted to give you a little bit my thoughts on what to do with respect to trying to maintain your marketing and branding investments, which obviously I advocate for that. But also I think I'm in an interesting position to share with you what the relationship should be between a client and a service provider, given that I've been on both sides. Well, actually, the first thing that I think is important to keep in mind that we have to start shifting our focus is that we will be constantly in crisis. I'm sure you've heard the concept of VUCA, this idea of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And that is our common life. And you know this very well in Iceland. You have been through a very heavy crisis several years ago also, but that was not the first crisis. And the one we're living now won't be the last crisis. Probably maybe 6 months or 18 months or 25 months from now, we will be in another crisis. So it's this important thing that I think it's not to think about the life post-COVID or post-corona or post-crisis, but just to start thinking and figuring out what to do, being constantly in a crisis. And interestingly, when you think about this crisis, and I was obviously looking up some data based on the Marketing Week in the UK, some survey that was out there, it was around 50% of the respondents were actually cutting down their marketing budgets pretty much to survive. And I really started to thinking about it actually back in my days when I had to be cut budgets and my boss was telling me, I don't care, do whatever you have to do, but we need to cut expenses. And happens all the times, right? You cut down on marketing expenses. Another fantastic candidate I'm sure many of you have gone through is recruiting, the hiring freezes as they call it, research costs, some random services, PR, events, all these sorts of things. And to some extent, this cutting is human nature, right? Looking a little bit deeper, I try to understand what goes in the mind, both from the client side and from the service provider. When I was a client, and I remember that budgets were cut and I was forced to cut budgets, what happened? And I'm sure much of this will also resonate with you, right? You had to postpone many projects that you felt were capital for the organization. You really lost momentum of some specific projects that really meant a lot to you, where you invested a lot of time. And this probably caused inefficiencies, right, after you had to postpone all these projects. Because of it, oftentimes, like today with furloughs happening, you have to increase your workload and increase the stress. Many corporate tensions arose. And then you have this thing that I call the day after syndrome, that you're already thinking, oh my God, what's going to happen when things come back to normal and I have to ramp up everything again back on. And then sometimes, and also happened to me, that because of this postponement of projects, you really were losing out maybe on a career opportunity or an advancement because you were really working on that fantastic project that would really shine very high on you. So that's on the client side. Now, for the ones who are on the service provider side, obviously crises like today are no fun, right? You have a reduction of fees, there are no project revenue, therefore there's no income. You might have to let people go, you downsize, you have to do furloughs, and hopefully, and I'm being very radical now, in the worst case, you might even have to close down, which means the end. I know I'm being very radical now on that, but it's happening all over the place if you look around, right? If you're a service provider, you know what I'm saying. And if you're on the client side, I'm sure you've heard this from some of your providers, how hard it is nowadays for them. But nevertheless, and obviously I'm also here to advocate for it, we are firm believers of the idea that you should maintain your marketing investment during any crisis. It's not just this one, not the past one, not the next one. During any crisis, we advocate for it. And as Winston Churchill said, never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think it's a fantastic quote because it very much applies to what we're discussing today. And this idea of a crisis, to actually see it as an opportunity. There are many, many examples. But interestingly, I also went further and thought about what makes us always like to cut, or why should we not cut? And I also thought from a psychological angle that a reason not to cut is just purely psychological. That, as Sun Tzu said, you might remember this huge warrior in the, 12th or 13th century, that said, the best defense is to attack, right? When you are supposed to defend yourself, when you're supposed to entrench yourself, it's actually the best opportunity to really go out there. And with many, many, many examples of companies across the world and throughout history that have actually used such a crisis as an opportunity to actually gobble up other companies. My personal experience, 20 years ago, I worked for a US firm named Forrester Research based in Boston. And actually, we did that during the big crisis of 2001, which was the Web 1.0 crisis. Instead of like really reducing things, we actually took all the money we had in the bank and probably with some loans, and we actually bought up the competition. So it's a fantastic way actually to really make a difference in the marketplace. Obviously, you will have to afford it. Another way to look at it is just biology, right? And maybe I feel it myself because I have a little bit of an overweight problem, right? And if you think about it, losing weight is much tougher than regaining it, right? So this is the same thing with the crises. It's you can cut on your investments, but whatever you lose with it, be it market share, be it awareness, any sort of marketing KPI or business KPI measurement, it will be much more difficult than afterwards to regain it. So it's a little bit this analogy on how difficult it is to lose weight and how easy it is to regain it. But then, for instance, for our friends who like behavioral economics, Kahneman and the likes, you probably have lost it. I thought about the idea of the loss aversion, right, which is another reason from a behavioral economics that you should not reduce your marketing investments. The idea that people prefer avoiding losses to actually acquiring equivalent gains, said in economics terms. And that actually very much also applies to what happens to why we actually like to cut budgets and marketing, right? Because we really prefer to avoid losses. So all these different angles, I thought would illustrate a little bit more the situation. And then pure technically, from all the research done out there, there are extremely many studies that prove that cutting down on marketing is a bad investment, because once you regain on more of a normal situation, you might not have reached the same market share. I mean, there are many, 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 many reasons and many studies out there that prove it, right? If you maintain your marketing spend, you nourish your existing clients, you actually increase your voice in the marketplace because the other ones have reduced it. So relatively, your voice is more heard. And then very importantly, you convey market strength, right? You signify to your different audiences, not just to your consumers, but also other audiences out there, that you are strong, that you can do whatever it takes to maintain your strength throughout a crisis. And surely, lastly, this idea that you neutralize this day after syndrome, what happens once you have to ramp up everything, and which is often very much associated with lots of inefficiencies. So what are all the implications for branding? Obviously, we could speak now for hours about it, but my quick take on it is that first, for us being brand consultants, obviously brand is more than a logo, brand is more than just marketing. Brand is what you stand for, is everything that represents you. And therefore, you have to be very careful that if you cut marketing investments during a crisis, if you actually are hurting your brand DNA, your brand essence, because regaining that will be extremely difficult and will be very much in the long term. So, for instance, let's take a healthcare provider, or let's take an insurance company, or maybe even a bank, which are all companies and industries that very much build their brands, their foundations on trust, reliability, dependability, or even closeness to their consumers. You have to think twice if you're one of these industries, how you're actually cutting your marketing investments. Because by cutting your investments, you are being totally contradicting the actual foundations of your brand. So it will be really contradicting, and you will really send the extreme wrong message to the marketplace. Surely then you have the opposite. You have all these people, all these companies across all different sectors that they really want to be active, and they really want to show that they are around. Oftentimes very forcefully, very unnatural, right? And I call this the Me Too trap. Actually, when we sent you the presentation of Frederick you will have a little link there to a video on YouTube that I invite you to see on how little differentiation there is nowadays from TV spots from many, many companies during the COVID crisis. So definitely, if you really do the investment during a crisis, really try to apply creativity and agility on it, and for surely always as long as it is really aligned with your brand DNA. I wanted to point out to actually a fantastic example of someone who really has done this alignment of I invest in the crisis, I have really a lot of communication active, but that is really aligned with your brand DNA. And you might have heard of this UK beer company called Brewdog. And Brewdog just launched a new beer, a new ale that is called Barnard Castle Eye. And for some of you who might follow UK politics, you might know about this Dominic Cummings, who was this advisor to Boris Johnson. And during confinement, he went to see this castle. So actually, Brewdog making fun of all this and following their brand DNA and essence, which is all about this humor and wittiness, they launched during the Corona crisis this special edition for the beer. So you will also see it in the presentation. I also invite to actually read about it, because it's a fantastic example how to turn things around and say, okay, me now doing all this communication during this crisis is actually fostering and making my brand essence and brand DNA much stronger. So the bottom line for the brands, at least the ultimate rule here, is that your actions or your lack of actions should never contradict your brand DNA. So if you stop doing actions, if that contradicts your brand DNA, big mistake. And any sort of actions you do, if you do them, always have them aligned with your brand DNA or essence. Because keep in mind also that definitely branding is for the long term. So whatever you destroy, right, it will be very difficult then to regain. Same thing as the weight loss I shared before. Now, with all this, you might now say, okay, Fernando, I know this. I mean, I read it, and my boss still wants me to cut down, right? I cannot convince him. So what can you do, right? I very much enjoy what you're saying here, but you're not really helping me out here. So what can you do? Well, let's again see this from both ends, right? Let's see this from the client side and from the service provider side. Let's start with the client side, many of you are, as to not cutting marketing expenses. So the first thing I think is to really identify what I call the no-goes for your brand. What cutting is really hurting your brand DNA? First, identify that. And then with all your strength and power, you need to convince your organization not to go through that, because you will have long-lasting damage to it. The second one, which is happening actually quite often, and especially in more sophisticated, data-driven organizations, probably oftentimes, the fast-moving consumer goods, the PepsiCos of the world, and the Johnson & Johnsons, and the Colgate-Palmolive, and all these. Don't cut, or don't try to cut your market investments. Try to shift them to something else. Because yes, you can tell your boss, I'm cutting down, but instead of doing something with or cutting it, I'm shifting it. And that actually might do the trick. Maybe not full of it, but to part of it. Because obviously in a crisis situation, you need to be agile and you need to adapt to what's happening. And that probably requires a change of channel. It might require a change of audience or target. So don't cut, try to shift. The third one, and this might be also a message more to the managing directors and the CEOs that I know are also present there, is to seriously revise the managerial short-termism, as you call it. I've suffered it lots, right? How many times did you have to take probably wrong actions because of the share price, because of what happened 3 months down the road? So you were really always forced to think very much in the short term, not in the long term. Now, the only ones who can change that is you, the CEO and the managing director. You are the ones who can change this. And the way to change this is changing your compensation schemes. I'm actually just reading now the memoirs, the biography of Disney's CEO, Robert Iger. And very interestingly, he mentions that in the book, that the only way really to make change happen, innovation, change, adaptation in any organization starts by changing the compensation schemes. That will have an immediate effect. And last but not least, as to not cutting the marketing expenses from the client end, is really see the crisis as an opportunity, as an investment, as the examples I shared early on. Now, how about the client side with service providers? More and more you work more closely with service providers. More and more there's a co-creation happening. More and more there are ecosystems forming. So the first thing, and I'm saying that now from a agency perspective, keep the communication flowing. Just don't stop the communication. We have many clients who just really just shut down and said, let's talk back in September. And I think it's a big mistake. We have other clients who really keep up the communication with us. They find out very interesting things from us, what's happening to other companies. So they're actually benefiting from that communication. And I invite you to do the same. The other one is truly be transparent about your budget situation. Otherwise, you're just wasting everyone's time, right? Giving big hopes to your providers if you don't have the budgets is not really helping anyone. And it's not really helping your provider either, because you're making waste their time. Another one is start already engaging in future projects. I mean, you don't have to start the project, but knowing that the budgets will be back, you can already start preparing things. And probably that will only strengthen the communication and the relationship you have with the provider. And then obviously, and we have all been through that, and I'm not going to go in detail, definitely seek innovative ways to bypass the budget cuts. And you know what I mean. It's actually called financial reengineering. So obviously, I don't want to get in trouble here, given that this is being recorded, but you definitely know what I mean. Now, let's go over to the service provider. What can a service provider do from the audience?
Sorry, Fernando. I know your friends call you Fidel. You know, that's funny, but we are over on time. So maybe if you'll get to the wrap up.
Yeah, it's the last slide actually now.
Okay.
So what can you do as a service provider? Well, accept that it will happen again. Impose yourself a financial war chest. I know it sounds easier said than done. Switch to operational mode. Truly understand what your clients are going through, because most of the times many providers don't do that. Modulate your offer, break down your offer into things that might be easier to digest for your clients. And last but not least, evolve. Use it as an opportunity to train, to change, to upskill. And having said that, keep calm, keep on fighting, carry on, and invest in marketing. That was it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This is great, Fernando. Very inspiring. If I would have had a choice of looking at you or the slides, I would always have had a direct view of you. But we will rectify the situation with the slides afterwards. We'll send them out. We'll fix them into your talk. So thank you very much. It's really enlightening. Maybe just one question from me, and actually not from me, from one of the audiences. They are asking, okay, now that we have the situation going on, but wouldn't it be frowned upon in some cases to be taking advantage of the situation and, using COVID as an excuse to, gain market share?
Well, that's a very good question. I think the answer to that depends how you do it, right? And I refer back to this example from BrewDog. I think if your brand, the foundations of your brand is built on pillars, like the case of BrewDog, which is wittiness, humor. I just give this very concrete example. Everyone is taking it the right way by them actually, so to speak, making fun of this advisor to Boris Johnson who broke the confinement. If it's aligned with your values, with your brand DNA, then you will be fine. The danger comes if it's forced. The danger comes, as the person who actually states the question, is if you do something that is really not aligned with your values and your essence, because people will look through it very quickly, more than ever, right? We live in a world nowadays where audiences, consumers, and not just consumers, the general public, everything is extremely transparent. We know why, social media and the likes. And liars or people really forcing things will not work out in the long term. So you have to be very careful how you go and do about that. In the example I mentioned before, from that we used our financial chest actually to buy up another company. I think it's a normal business structure situation and competitive markets. I personally don't see there are issues with that. There are always winners and losers in crises. And we go back to Churchill. Use the crisis as an opportunity. Don't let it go to waste.
No, great, a good answer. But just maybe a fundamental last question, and you've answered it, already. But if I'll try to condense it into a very short question. When reality hits you and you don't have any money, but I do have all your good arguments, can we really say don't stop spending on advertising when we have a hard time, getting by? Can we answer this in a short way? I mean, this is what the CEOs want to know. I mean, what is the best? Let me rephrase. What's the best justification for the CEO to say, okay, don't cut marketing spending because
Well, obviously, if you're near a death situation, probably you can't do anything to avoid it. Obviously, you understand that. And we don't want to be in that situation. Unfortunately, I'm sure there are many people who have been in that situation, who are in that situation. I think the important argument to understand is that the short-term savings definitely do not justify the rather mid to long-term additional investment you will have to do to actually get to the previous situation. I think that's technically the reason why you shouldn't do that, especially in what I tried to mention before, investments or marketing activities that are really associated with the heart of your brand. So the idea is maybe to analyze, structure, segment the sorts of marketing investments you have, which ones are for the long term, which ones are for the short term, which ones are strategic, which ones are tactical, and from there try to make the best decisions on what to cut. And then again, I think I invite everyone to really be also creative about this idea of shifting. More and more companies, instead of just cutting things, they're saying, okay, let's try to shift and make the best out of it.
Really good. Thank you, Fernando. I know you have a very, very important client meeting that you run to. So just on behalf of Brand and all of us here in Iceland, thank you very much.